Welcome from whatever part of the country you call yours. My name's Nic Kentish, and it's wonderful to have you on this, our RCS Warble. A couple of quick things. You've all come into the webinar muted, and we're going to leave it that way, unfortunately, because there's so many of us and we don't have enough time for questions tonight, unfortunately. But if you're happy to, please turn your camera on and leave it on. Keep your clothes on, and we'd love to see your smiling faces. So, the pioneer who is my guest tonight didn't just hit agriculture recently. Terry McCosker, the founder of RCS, Resource Consulting Services, started out his working life over 55 years ago as a researcher with the rare capacity to operate his grazing and livestock experiments on a commercial scale, like real life stuff, not just tiny plots of trials. And like all pioneers, Terry's discovered as many things that don't work as do work. And today, he's here to share 55 years of agricultural wisdom. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Nic, and welcome everybody. Thank you for giving up some time. Let's hope there's some wisdom there, Nic.
I'm sure, Terry. We collectively there's a lot of wisdom in the background on this webinar, but I'm particularly interested in yours. And I know the little bit that you've shared with me that this started a lot longer than 55 years ago. So tell me about your parents and the indelible impact that they had on you.
Yeah, Nic, I grew up on a dairy farm. It was actually a mixed farm. We had dairy cows and produced cream, and we had some pigs, and we grew some peanuts and maize and lucerne and a whole range of things. And it was a life that I absolutely loved. And Dad had come back from the war, and we went on to a block that was actually owned by Mum's parents, and Mum and Dad bought that from them. And Dad wasn't a farmer, really didn't enjoy it much, and wanted to get out of there, but Mum was the farmer and she loved it. So I got from Mum a love of the land, and I got from Dad a humanity, I think, that he really got from spending 4 years in New Guinea.
Wow. So how did they come to be on that land, that particular land?
It was my grandparents' land, and they'd owned a few properties, and my grandfather was a settler in that area, and he'd acquired a few little blocks here and there, and that's how we ended up there.
Oh, so you were generational then?
Yeah. Well, it must have been third generation there, in fact, yeah.
Yeah. So you got 5 siblings. What impressions would they be thrilled to know that they left on you?
That my parents left on me?
And your siblings as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that all my siblings have actually been very successful. And my elder brother's, he's actually one of the smartest people I've ever met, with an unbelievable, I think he's got a photographic memory. And yeah, I've got, a couple of other brothers and 3 other brothers and a sister, and they've all been very successful in business and in life.
Is there a kind of Irish wisdom that makes all the McCoskers so ambitious and so successful and so capable?
I suspect it was how we grew up, actually. We grew up with nothing. Today you would class what we grew up in as abject poverty. In fact, at Christmas times, we used to joke with Mum that, she would cut the bottoms out of our pockets so we had something to play with at Christmas. And, but it was, we had no water, in fact, so we would have a wash once a week as a family, all in the same little dish of water. And that's the way I grew up. And I suppose that even though that was a great childhood and we actually loved it, I suppose that most of us actually wanted to do a bit better than that.
Yeah, special treats would have been really the most fundamental things. But what's your greatest memory of the most special treat?
Chewing gum. Dad used to bring home a bit of chewing gum when we were kids occasionally, and yeah, that was probably the first thing that comes to mind.
So what happened a little later when you approached your father to take on the dairy farm? Terry?
Yeah, I wasn't doing too well at school, and probably what most people don't know about me is I managed to actually fail primary school. I had to repeat grade 7, and then I managed to fail high school as well. So you know, I've been a pretty successful at failing actually, and so I approached Dad. I wanted to go back on the land. I'd always wanted to do that. And I said to him, I could still remember we were walking down from the dairy one night after milking, and I said, you know, I'd really like to take this over. And he said, there's no way in the world any of you kids are coming back here. Go and get yourself a job. He said, if you really want to stay in agriculture, go and join the department or something like that, or you know. And he actually said, become an advisor, and that's what happened. As much by accident as by design.
So, I mean, you've helped thousands of people sort out their visions and goals over the years, Terry. So as you drove out of the driveway after that denial, do you recall any visions or goals or epiphanies that you had then?
I think it was a realization that that farm was actually too small, and there was 5 of us, and it really wasn't even a living for Mum and Dad, and he knew that, and I didn't know that at the time. And I guess it was I took his advice actually, and I let that dream go at that point, and you had another one. So I learned very early on. I heard this statement that says, "Have always a dream in your pocket." And Pam will probably attest to the fact that I've had too many dreams in my life, and that I've done too much dreaming and probably not enough doing. But and that's probably led to many dry gullies. But anyway, I still got. I've always had dreams in my pocket.
As is the lot of a pioneer, I suppose. You are a rare breed, and so then having failed high school, so you took it so far, and then realised that you couldn't go any further, or they wouldn't let you back in. Where did you go next?
Well, I actually joined Queensland DPI, so they were quite happy to take failures on at that stage. And I was really fortunate, actually. Back then, they were so short of staff, they'd take on anybody. And I went straight in there as a cadet. I think I was, must have been 17. And it was, if coincidentally, only about a week ago, Pam actually found my appointment letter from the DPI, dated November 1967, and there was instructions in there that how I could get to Brisbane, and they even gave me a train fare to get to Brisbane. So it was interesting, and that gave me a few years in the big smoke, 4 years there, and I studied. Once I got there and started studying agriculture, I loved it. And it was pretty easy. So I did that studied for 5 years while I was a cadet at DPI, and then became an experimentalist, and then ended up in Innisfail. I was working in Brisbane in the dairy industry to begin with, and pastures and dairy and stuff like that. And I had a passion even then that sort of could get me into trouble. And one of the things I did one day, I sat down and wrote a paper on Pangola grass, and my boss at the time took it to his boss and came back with red ink all over it. But the higher bloke said, "This is good." He said, "Don't worry about the red ink." He said, "You got to get the emotion out of it." It was my first sort of lesson in the fact that I was a bit emotional about things. And anyway, the boss's boss actually got it published against a hell of a lot of opposition in DPI. So I think I was still the youngest person ever to publish in DPI, and that I wrote it at 18 and it was published when I was 19. And so that's probably a record that won't be broken. But anyway, it was because of passion. And so from there I ended up in Innisfail, working in the beef industry. But I got to a point where I sort of figured that what I was doing there wasn't actually contributing to agriculture in the real world. And so I spent a bit of time trying to figure out how to get out. And so firstly, I went flying. I got my private pilot's license, and then I got my commercial pilot's license. And the next step was to get an ag rating. And I was going to take over the ag flying business in Innisfail. And thankfully, I never did, because I probably wouldn't be here today. I certainly wouldn't be here in this capacity, but I probably wouldn't have been here at all if I'd taken on that job. But that was a route to try and get out. But fortunately, I didn't have to go down that route in the end, and ended up in the Territory.
So it must have been an amazing feeling then to have gone from well, the abject failure, which you weren't, but you hadn't felt the thrill of wins, because you hadn't discovered the learning is your passion and agricultural learning is your passion. So you got that, you get a pilot's license, and that takes a bit of nutting stuff out as well. So the thrill of getting that, and then the motivation to keep going, must have been a big learning that you could do this stuff. It wasn't like you were too dumb to do anything.
Yeah, I worked out that like the school system wasn't for me, the way that we operated schools. That just didn't suit my way of learning. And I've since found out that I'm zero on auditory. So I could sit in a lecture or listen to something, and I'll pick up zero out of it. But so I've got to do things to learn. And I could pick up, a fair bit from reading, but just listening to stuff doesn't work for me. So that was the way school was back then. But I think, when I was in Innisfail, Pam and I actually, because probably the best thing I did when I was in Innisfail, I actually married Pam. And that was, and I think I achieved something there that I look back on with a real smile. And I went away for the weekend and met Pam. She'd been away for about a year and a half. And I came back the next, I think I got back in the office the following Tuesday, and I just said to Smoko table, I got engaged over the weekend, and everyone turned around and said, "Who to?" And I thought that was quite funny. But, but that was, we got heavily involved in the community, and we had our son, Sean, when we were in Innisfail as well. But we decided to take the journey to the Territory after that.
Was Innisfail the early 70s you're talking? That would have been a fair old outpost, wouldn't it?
No, it was a wonderful community. They even had a conservatorium of music, and it was a wonderful community. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful! And so, when did you go to Darwin, and what was going on in Darwin when you got there?
I was employed on a big place in the Territory. My job description was they wanted somebody who knew something about growing grass. And Pam and I went over, and we had a 3-day interview. And at the end of that period, they said to me, and this was owned by Americans at the time, and I was interviewed by 3 sort of fairly senior executives out of the US. And at the end of that time, they said, "Well, you've got the job." And I said, "I don't want it." And they said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because I don't know anything about this environment." I said, "I don't know the trees, I don't know the grass, I've never worked with an extensive breeder herd. You should go off to the local department and find somebody that knows what they're doing." And they said something to me then that I've never, ever forgotten. And it's actually stood me in really good stead for most of my life. And they said, "No, we want somebody who has no preconceived ideas." And you wouldn't believe how that actually paid off. It paid off, in so many ways, because I had no paradigms about what I was supposed to do. And to work out what I should have done, I had to go back to first principles. And that was probably where I first started to run into opposition. I discovered the wet season protein deficiency in Northern Australia, and I was ridiculed by scientists and people that said that's just rubbish. And it was rubbish until CSIRO or somebody else proved it, you know. But people just told me I was nuts. And it was all sorts of things like that that I was able to, because I had no paradigms, I could look at things completely differently. And I think it's one of the reasons why once we started RCS, we were teaching about paradigms right from the beginning, because I think that, you know, we're constrained by our paradigms, our training, our upbringing, you know, our background, all of those things constrain us. And I think that it's actually been an advantage not to be so highly educated and to work things out from first principles all the time. And I knew enough about agriculture to be able to do that. And that was an incredible experience. And I think in what I do today, that actually led me to understanding systems and understanding that things have got to fit together. And what was happening when I was on that property, because after about 6 months, I told them to sell up and go because it wasn't working. And so they said, well, you put together an R&D program to fix the problem. So I said, rightio. So I actually did that, gave them an R&D program, and then within 6 or 8 weeks of giving them that and a budget, I changed my mind and wanted to go 180 degrees away from that, because my gut said that what I was actually wanting to research was wrong. And I had no reason to accept that, but my gut just was really strong. And I guess that's another lesson, you know, that we all need to listen first and foremost to our gut. You know, and when your head's saying something and your gut's saying something else, go with your gut. It is always right, and it doesn't matter what anyone else is saying or thinking. You know, in terms of the, you know, the current seasons and so on, if you know you're thinking, should I get rid of these animals or not? And your head's thinking, oh, gee, you know, the price is not right, etc. And your gut's saying, you've got no grass to feed them. You're going to get yourself in debt if you stay there, you know. And so go with what your gut's saying instead of what your head's saying or what you're reading in the press, etc. So I guess one of the things I learned back then is I had to persuade all these high-level executives that I wasn't actually a complete nutcase, because at that stage I'd given them a research proposal that went in one direction, and 6 weeks later I changed it 180 degrees away. And so they actually tried to fire me, and couldn't find anybody to replace me in a hurry, so they decided that we're going to have it out. So they came to the station, and we sat around for 3 days with a big whiteboard, and I explained my paradigm shift. And at the end of 3 days, I had them believing that I was actually right. And that's a pretty big thing for 60, 70-year-old really senior executives to accept from a 28-year-old wet behind the ears ex-DPI person. And so in the end, they believed me, but I could only convince them because my gut had convinced me. And it turned out that I was absolutely right, that we were going initially in the wrong direction. And so we were going in the direction that was conventional wisdom. And if they hadn't picked somebody that didn't know what he was doing, you know, that had no preconceived ideas, then we would have continued on down the path of conventional wisdom. So, you know, and I got a lot of opposition as a result of that, but I think you've got to learn that when you want to do something and your gut's saying it's right, then it's right for you, and you've got to have the strength of your convictions.
And strategically, what was the essence of what you changed there? What did you go that 180 degree shift towards?
Well, the territory at that stage operated on a system of cattle hunting, and you had properties that had very, very low overheads, but also very, very low productivity. And you know, if the price was reasonable and you had enough animals running around, you actually didn't know how many you had, but if you could see a few, then you'd go out and catch some. And there was a few meatworks around at that stage, and so you know that you got through on that. Now, what they did was they then introduced improved pastures and started putting fertilizer on them and things like that, and it all turned to weeds, and the productivity was no different even though they'd spent a lot of money and had massive overheads, the productivity was no different to what it was under the original system. So they actually had the worst of both worlds. They didn't get a productivity increase, but they had a massive increase in overheads. And so what I said to them is, you've got to get out of that. You know, they were using, you know, fruit pastures, legumes, all that sort of stuff, and stylos and things, which was the conventional wisdom of the day. And, you know, I looked around and I said, this is not working. And so I said, what you've got to do is let's get out of this in this middle ground that they were actually in. And I said, let's look at supplementation to increase the productivity of your breeders on native grass, and then look at really highly developed pastures based on new grasses, so that we could get high carrying capacity and high productivity at the same time. And what we achieved was we went from 14% death rate in our breeders to 2%, and we went from 44% reproduction rate to 72%, which is not bad on some of the, what I would class as some of the worst country I've ever seen, and poorest country I've ever seen. So we solved a lot of problems with our cows, and then we actually developed. I actually went back to CSIRO and people like that, and they sent me 300 odd species of grasses and just tiny little packets of seed. So I went and planted 3,000 plots based on these tiny little packets of seed. And out of that, I discovered a range of species that would actually grow in that country without fertilizer. And so we then developed pastures now. So we took country there from a beast to 100 acres to where you can now virtually run a beast to the acre on some of that country with the pastures that I developed back then without fertilizer. You still need supplements because there's no guts in the country. But you know, we increased the weaning weight, growth rate on steers, all that sort of stuff. And it was a systems approach, basically. I broke it down into what were they doing, what wasn't working, and then turned around and said, righto, let's just break, you know, the system's broken, so let's get out of what we're doing and do something else. And I think that's a lesson for life as well. Sometimes if you know, if something's not working, then the sooner you actually recognize that and do something different, the better off you are. And I've also learned that bitter lesson a few other ways with some of my dry gullies. But you know, it's when you're in trouble, stop, pull up. And sometimes, you know, and I guess through the EL process over time and working with so many people, I've actually really learned that often you've got to stop doing what you're doing to leave room and space for something else to come in that will be better than where you're at.
Yeah, we'll come back to EL and Executive Link directly, but tell me about Cliff Emerson and the influence that he had on you, Terry.
Well, Cliff was a Texan, and he employed me originally. He had a master's degree in rangeland science, but I think the great thing about Cliff was he just said to me, you go figure it out. And he gave me the freedom to do that. And then when I wanted to completely change the paradigms, the first person I had to convince was Cliff. And I can still recall sitting on our lawn for a whole weekend, arguing and chewing the fat and so on, and eventually had him convinced, and then he was a supporter. But he was probably one of the best people I've ever worked for. He would just talk, you know, and I remember once he said, can you figure out how to do something or other? It was something to do with monitoring anyway. So I went away and I figured it out and came back and said, this is how I think we should do it. And he said, yeah, I think so. And pulled out a file and said, this is the way I would have done it. And like, he had the answer there. And he knew the answers when he asked the question, but he didn't give me the answer. And he allowed me the freedom to create answers. And that's a great learning as well in terms of people that you employ, and just give people freedom to express themselves and to create their own roles and their own abilities.
I think one of the great things that you've taught in the Grace for Profit schools at the very outset, you say we're going to show you one side, and your job's to find the other three of the square.
Yeah, that comes from Stan Parsons, that one.
Isn't that great? So, what was the greatest shift then from Terry the researcher to Terry the systems thinker?
It happened because I had complete freedom when I was doing this research, and virtually an unlimited budget as well. And so I was employing scientists and experts from all sorts of fields from all over the world, and they'd come in as a consultant, and you might have somebody on reproductive physiology, and with his blinkers on, he could say, well, if you just do this, that'll solve 80% of your problems. And then I'd bring a soil guy in, and he'd say, well, you just need to fix that phosphorus problem, and that'll solve 80% of your problems. And, you bring in an expert on bull fertility, and you just fix that, and that'll solve 80% of your problems. And so I had all these 80% solutions, and I'm not really good at maths, but I sort of figured out pretty quickly that lots of 80% don't actually work out. And so what I learned to do was synthesize what they were bringing up. And there was lots of times when they're really good advice and really smart stuff, but it just didn't fit. So I would just not do it. And so I had some people, there were some guys, they only worked for me about twice because they'd come back and see that I hadn't done what they suggested the first time. So, and they didn't want to go through that again, so they pinged off. But there was good reason for me not to take their advice most of the time. But I got something out of everybody, whether it was something I acted on or something I just learned. It was still valuable to me, but I didn't necessarily incorporate everything they told me into the business. And that, I was basically given a cattle station, and at that stage had 12,000 breeders on it. We cut that back to 6,000 so we could concentrate on the R&D, and unlimited resources, and just said, put this thing back together again and make it work. And that's an incredible opportunity to be given at 28. And I'm forever grateful for that opportunity, because I learned so much. I learned so much about every discipline, in fact, I learned about reproduction. I learned about ecology. I learned about business. I saw my first spreadsheet actually back in, must have been about 78. And these were these Harvard MBA graduates. And a spreadsheet back then was sheets of A4 paper put together right around the room. So there was, there might have been 180 or 200 sheets of paper stuck together with sticky tape and put up on the wall, and you walked around and you looked at that, and that was a spreadsheet. And when spreadsheets come out on computers, I actually knew what a spreadsheet was and where it had come from. But yeah, that's the I suppose generation I've come from. That I saw the spreadsheets in paper before I saw them on computer. It was amazing, though, to be exposed to that level of thinking and where those guys were at back, in the 70s.
You differentiated before about the head thinking and the heart thinking. Did you have a formula for sorting out the information or the advice that you took and the advice that you decided to ignore?
It was based on my gut most of the time, and really just asking the question, did it fit? Because I had a pretty clear view of what I needed to create and what I needed to do. So, I just said, well, did that fit? Did it fit economically? Did it fit ecologically? Did it fit practically? There's a whole lot of questions that you can actually ask yourself, and it's pretty quick. You can pretty quickly sort out whether it fits or not. And I think a lot of people are faced with that stuff today. There's so much more knowledge around and information around, but how do you sift it? And I think today I sift it with principles. So I wasn't aware really, well, I was aware of first principles back then, but probably much more aware of principles now. And so I use principles to sift information now. So if there's knowledge there, or there's a paper, or there's, some scientific guy rabbiting on about something, that if it doesn't actually fit within the principles as I know them, then I can cull it. And if it fits within the principles, then I can figure out, well, is it useful or not?
David Hamlin and you got together in Darwin, and that might have been the genesis of RCS. Was there another sliding door that could have happened at that time?
Oh, there was. I was actually we had a header. I had a header actually. Pam wasn't all that keen on the header, and but I had a header and machinery and stuff like that in the territory, and I never should have done it because I hate machinery and I hate headers, and it I guess, and the lesson out of that is do what you're passionate about, not what you're not passionate about. And it was that was in the 80s, and it was a typical 80s thing where I actually started focusing on trying to make some money, and I had a ridiculous goal, and this thing was going to make me a lot of money, and it finished up breaking us. And so there was a big lesson there. There was a lot of lessons actually, and so the first and foremost was, do what you're passionate about. Secondly, understand what your values are, because I don't actually value money, and here I was off trying to do something to chase money, and it took me in the opposite direction. And so and I suppose the other bitter lesson that I learned out of that was, when you're digging a hole and it's not looking too good, stop digging. And I had no mentor. I had nobody to tell me to stop digging, and I dug and dug and dug till there was no daylight left. And at the end of that period, all I had left was Pam and 3 beautiful girls and nothing else. And fortunately, they stuck with me because it was a rough time. And then we actually started again. When we started RCS in Yeppoon in 1990, we actually started with a negative net worth, no cash flow. We owed a lot of people money. We still were trying to pay off machinery that wasn't working and all sorts of stuff. And we ended up doing all of that. But it was a change of vision. And I did realize a year or two after that the reason that I went backwards so fast and so hard was that what I was doing was not compatible with my values.
Something you made a really big impression on was a successful Aboriginal community development project on pastoral area in the territory. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, in the 80s with RCS in the territory, because we started in 85, and David Hamden and I started in 85, and we mostly worked on Aboriginal stuff through till 1990 when I started work with Stan Parsons. And there's one property up there that, when I hear things like The Voice and everything that's going on, and I reflect back on what have I actually seen work with Indigenous people, and this community actually worked, and it worked for a long time. And the elements that made it work, I think, was firstly, there were 5 elders, 5 brothers that ran that community in a fairly traditional way. And the police and everyone else got out of their way and allowed them to run and do discipline traditionally. And so they actually had control of that community, and it was a great little community. We built them a meatworks. Every other Aboriginal community in that whole region lost their stations, lost their cattle, and this one community then was feeding the others with beef. And so they were actually doing quite well out of the other communities around them. But it was a stable community. Kids were going to school, people were working as they needed to, as they wanted to. They were still going bush when they wanted to, do their traditional stuff as they needed. But it was the strength of those elders that actually made that community work with the right support. And we gave them some good support. And it was really a joint thing, we worked out what did they want to do, and then we sort of enabled that, and it went for a long time.
It's a great feat. So Stan Parsons come into your life, and that was the transition to head sort of out of the territory and back towards Queensland. And you were also really struck by tragedy losing Sean in that time. Did that really send you into a new realm of drive? What did you do with that?
We lost Sean very early in our time at Mount Bundy. That was in 1980, right at the beginning of 1980. And the day he died, I vowed there and then that his life would not be in vain, and I would make a difference to honour his life. And that drove me very, very hard for probably 25 years, and I drove everyone around me too hard, probably for that same period until I got over it. And I think that I hope that I've delivered on that. But that was certainly the vow that I made to him, and I think that certainly has driven me very, very hard.
So Stan was delivering ranching for profit, which you saw delivered in his way in Australia at that time. So you saw something that you wanted more of. How did you take it on from there and not get Stan's nose out of joint?
No, Stan continued to teach in Australia for many years, and I was the sorcerer's apprentice for quite a long time before he would let me teach. I think I did 15 GFPs before I was allowed to do much at all, and but that was great training, and I probably only was allowed to teach in the end because he was coming out here to teach a school in Toowoomba once, and basically on the way out, his father passed away, and he diverted and went to Zimbabwe, and I continued on and taught the school, and so there wasn't any option, and it sort of worked. So I continued on after that. But I'd had a good apprenticeship. I'm a great believer in apprenticeships. Learning and working at the same time with good mentors, and you learn a lot through that process and by doing. But I guess that's my learning style, actually, is doing.
Every business along the way, as it grows and consolidates and grows and consolidates, they're kind of steps. It's not a nice general ascension, but so you have heydays and dry times no matter what the business is. What heydays and dry times solutions did you come up with as you grew RCS?
Well, it was very, very tough in the beginning. We had no money, we had no capital. In fact, we had debt, and we're trying to start a new business in a new field early on. And I guess what I did was the DPI tried to put me out of business, and that made me sort of sit up and think, well, who's right here? Is Stan Parsons right, or is the DPI right? And because they said, what we were doing was heretical, really, and that they were going to run us out. So I applied for a Churchill Fellowship in 1990, which is when we ran the first school, and I was very lucky to get it. And so I went overseas in 1991, and I studied cell grazing, and I went everywhere where Parsons and Savory had ever been. I went right back to their roots in Zimbabwe and South Africa, Namibia. Went right through the US and looked at this thing in all sorts of environments. And I was looking for failures, and I found plenty. But I couldn't fault the fundamental principles. When I found failures, I could always fault what people were doing. You could see what they were doing wrong. Not that I was pointing that out to people, but you could see it. And so I was then convinced that Stan was actually right. So that was 91 before I was fully convinced. So I'd been working with him since 89. Because remember, I'd come out of the government and DPI paradigm of which was continuous grazing is the only way to do things. And so I had to decide how was I going to handle the opposition, because the opposition to what we were doing was enormous. We had CSIRO up in arms. We had every state department of agriculture in Australia up in arms for this ridiculous stuff that we were starting to try and convince farmers to do. And I had to work out how am I going to handle that. And so what I decided was that, and Stan and I had talked to people and tried to convince them and just said, listen to what we're saying instead of going off the handle without even knowing what we're saying, which is what was happening. Anyway, I decided, and I still remember this, sitting in a hotel in Harare in Zimbabwe, waiting for the flight home while I was writing my Churchill Fellowship report. I sort of said, what the hell am I going to do? And I decided that right there and then that I would only work with people who wanted to listen, and I would never again try and convince people that didn't want to listen. And that strategy worked. I just worked with farmers and people who are willing to listen. And the way it went, and basically it was word of mouth that grew RCS in the beginning. The Churchill Fellowship was pivotal actually in getting RCS going, because it gave me knowledge that was enough to help people get going, because if I'd just done a GFP with Stan, I'd have the same knowledge as everyone else. I needed that big lift in knowledge to be able to support the growth in Australia. We did that. I learned a lot from the South Africans in 91. Went back there in 97 with a group of Aussies, expecting to learn a lot more from the Africans, and they were learning from us by 97. And so it was a big turnaround, and it was basically because, I suppose, partly because of my scientific background and experience and systems stuff, that we were thinking about it all from a systems perspective, but not even knowing that at the time, but that's just intuitively what you do. So we went back there and found that we'd actually got ahead of them very quickly, and were starting to teach them. And then a few years later, we went back and started running GFPs back there and really teaching a lot more of them.
The systems and cycles have probably been the giant leap from the paradigm of DPI to what you're saying that Stan shared with you and taught over those years. And, whether it be the carbon cycle, the water cycle, farming cycles, they're all cycles. And when we realize it's not linear, which you teach well, suddenly you can start to get a grip on where you are in the cycle. So where we are in the cycle now, Terry, what cool-headed wisdom could you sprinkle over the current grazing industry cycle that only a few laps around the block and a bit of grey hair can really do to put some wisdom on there?
It's a good question, Nick. I think I've experienced two once-in-a-lifetime sort of periods in the beef industry. The first one was in 2001. We had, the dollar was at 50 cents. So beef prices were high. Interest rates were still coming down. They were the lowest that we'd seen. And it was raining. So we had high prices, a low dollar, interest rates on the way down, and rain. And it was like, back then I said, well, this is a once in a lifetime experience, make the most of it, because these things don't last. And it didn't. It lasted about a year or so, and then down we went. And this cycle is somewhat similar. I think it was also probably another, lifetime one, for, depending on how old you are. If you're old enough, you get two of these. If you're young, you get one of them. This latest one was very similar in that interest rates were the lowest in history. Cattle prices were the highest in history, and it was raining. And you get all those things come together. And I think that 2001 one, it actually drove land prices right through to 2008, that one event. And I think that, you're seeing it now with the way commodity prices were, and that land prices just took off again without rhyme or reason. They're completely decoupled now from productivity. But these things, they don't last. They'll last, like we got 2 years out of this last one, which was pretty good, I think, and nearly 3 years out of the cattle prices. And the market has overcorrected, and now you see a sniff of rain and it's coming back up again. I think one of the reasons it's overcorrected is the media has done a fantastic job of creating fear over El Nino, and what we're getting right now is rain. and it's right on time. Certainly in Queensland, you know, it's about when you'd expect it. We weren't really in drought, but people thought they were in drought because they were told there's an El Nino, so therefore you must be in drought. And I think the other thing is that 2019 is still a pretty close memory for a lot of people, and people do not want to repeat that. So I think there's a couple of factors affecting the current, or, you know, over the last sort of pretty well 12 months, while this market has made such a massive correction. Quite frankly, I didn't expect it to correct this far. You know, I would have expected from a ECI point of view to get back to about 500 to 600, but it crashed right through that, you know, back to 380, but now it's, you know, back up in the 400s. And I would expect it to get back up into that 500 to 600 range again and probably sit there then for a number of years.
So I know you'd never be a person to say, I told you so, but what would you have, looking back on 2021, 22, the years that were, what do you wish you had have really said louder to some clients?
I probably wish I had have gone back and referred to 2001 and that period there and after it, shouted from the rooftops. So I probably didn't have a forum to do that too much because I stopped teaching back, when was it, 21. And so I only did a school again, the last one this year, but it was 2.5 years after I stopped. So I didn't have a forum to shout it too much. And I suppose that's one thing I miss now is that forum because when you're teaching, you've got to keep thinking, you've got to keep fresh, and you've got to keep, you know, what's really current right now. What do I know now that I really need to try and impart? You know, and I guess I miss that now. I feel a bit out of the loop in places.
I think we better get Pam to pack you up a few cut lunches and push you back out the door again, Terry.
Well, I'm getting out the door, but I'm not. I'm getting out the door a fair bit still, but not. I'm not in the same space anymore. I've sort of moved into a different space, and I guess a bit of age now has actually got me by request, really, at a government level and a policy level, and I'm now in a position to start influencing things at a higher level and a different level, and I think that's probably my role now, is rather than teach at an individual level, it's really try and get some common sense into what's going on at a whole lot of policy levels that are affecting agriculture.
Terry, what are your most valued achievements?
I think you don't achieve things and have a great life if you don't have a life partner. And Pam and I ticked off 50 years this year, 50 years married. And my second best achievement is that Pam raised 3 beautiful daughters while I was away. And they are beautiful citizens and beautiful human beings. And I think you can't do much better than that. I think those are probably my greatest achievement. Well, the 3 girls are Pam's greatest achievement. I tried to influence that when I come home, but a lot of the time you come home from being away for 2 weeks and you just upset the whole apple cart and they couldn't wait for you to go away again. But so really it was Pam that raised the girls, and she did a fantastic job with that. And I think in terms of agriculture, I have, I suppose, been involved in paradigm shifts. You know, in Northern Australia, identifying the wet season protein deficiency, identifying some of the issues with bull fertility in Northern Australia back in the 80s, even before there was DNA. I ran the team that created the first useful genetically modified rumen bug in the world to detoxify fluoroacetate. And that was back in the 80s when DNA was just a word. And I'd heard the word, so I went and did that because I didn't know it was impossible. And that's, you know, that's ignorance sometimes is a useful thing when you don't know that something's impossible. And it's quite similar at the moment with soil carbon. All the scientists know that it can't be done, but I didn't know that it was impossible. And so I think that, and the same with the grazing management. You know, I didn't know enough of the conventional wisdom to actually know that we shouldn't be cell grazing. So I think ignorance has actually been a useful tool, and it comes back to trying to not to have too many preconceived ideas when you're confronted with a problem. And I suppose the thing that turns me on still is solving a problem. And how do we overcome this, or how do we fix this up or make it better? But always for agriculture and the people on the land. That's just why I went into the carbon thing in the first place, was to, help people in the land earn an additional income and support for what they're doing for the environment. That took 20 years from when I started to think about it to when it happened. A lot of dry gullies between there and here too. So yeah, I think the Mount Bundy era, the stuff we did there was groundbreaking. We did stuff that had never been done before. We did it on a system scale, and it was large scale, and it was very effective, and we did it well, and we did it properly. So there was a lot of achievements there. I think RCS is an achievement. I think that what RCS has contributed, and not just me, like there's been over 100 staff go through RCS, and it's all the people that have gone through RCS that have made a contribution to agriculture in Australia. We've helped, with all of us, we've helped change paradigms, we've helped change lives. And I think one of the greatest rewards that I get now is when I'm out and about and I'm going to things and people just come up to me and so you probably won't remember me, and they're probably right. I did a school back in 1992 or something, and it just changed our lives. And, and I just get that feedback so much now that that it's just, so that says to me that what RCS has actually been doing has been worth it. And but the other indication, I suppose one of the other real fun things is that when I taught my last school, I taught my 12th grandchild. In other words, I taught the grandparents, the parents, and now the grandchildren. And I think to get 3 generations coming through GFP and a lot of second generation now as well is a testament to a lot of the people that have worked in RCS and the work that they've done with a lot of rural people. And so I think that, that's a massive achievement as well. I think the contribution that we've made there.
Certainly. Terry, you're an extraordinarily esteemed human being, yet you've kept your ego under control. And there's a big difference between self-esteem and self-importance. How do you understand that for you, and how have you done that?
Well, that's really simple, Nick, because I'm not important. The important people are the people on the land, the people that actually make the change. All I've done is spruik some ideas and help set up an organisation that can help that change process. But I'm not the one who's done the work. The real heroes are the people, all the people out there that have gone and made a difference to their land, their farm, their community, their family, as a result of some of what we have delivered to them. And I can't do that. I can't change landscape, and I know that that's not what I'm good at. So it's pretty bloody simple. I'm not important, and so I don't.
We were talking about those clients of RCS, particularly in Executive Link, who do go away and stick with Executive Link for 3 more years and go away and put stuff in action and come back and rejig it. And it's a small mention, we've made it tonight, but I'm aware that that Kelly's with us tonight, and she's got an RCS special offer that she was wanting to make mention of. So, Kel, can you come in from your corner, please?
Hi, you got me?
Gotcha.
I'm enjoying tonight. It's great.
You're learning something.
Yes, I am. Yeah. I did want to take a moment just to speak about Executive Link And I'll share to everyone's screens that I'm privileged to coordinate the Executive Link program in Australia and with RCS. And I'm really excited to share that there's several boards forming across Australia in 2024. And we've opened applications just this week for the round starting in March. And so I wanted to shout out, there's a lot of great opportunities there for a variety of businesses across different parts of Australia. And we do have, a special offer for all the businesses that commit to commence the program. So for those who commit to commence before the 7th of December in 2 weeks' time from now, we'll actually make sure you get an hour of power with Terry here. So you can spend that hour to cover whatever you want to. That's that you'd like to spend that time on. And to take advantage, contact us through the RCS website, look into Executive Link through the website there, or give me a call at RCS. So thank you.
Thank you, Kel. And what a great offer. Terry, you're going to have to live to be 195 by the time you get through all those 1 hours of power.
It'll be a pleasure, Nick. My purpose in life is to help people help themselves. And I recognize my purpose doing some, heavy work on myself, and actually seeing that purpose out in the ether is to help people help themselves. And so continuing to live my purpose, that'll keep me going until I'm 190. If I stop living my purpose, then, I'll curl up and disappear somewhere, I reckon. And there's still a lot to do.
Well, I would love to be able to come back and do this again in about 5,000 years' time with you, Terry, when they dig us up like Pompeii, and they're having a look at what agriculture in Australia was doing in the 2023s. I'd love to know what you would want them to find when they do that.
Well, I would want them to find the RCS vision, actually, which is, vibrant, healthy, biodiverse landscapes with, great water cycles, with people still creating wealth from the land and using the sun and the rainfall and all the freebies and all of those things that are free effectively. And they've been doing it for a very long time, and everyone's happy. We've got great communities and people are healthy, and the food that agriculture is producing is high quality, nutrient dense food. Our population has got over the few hundred years of consuming the wrong stuff, and we've got the food pyramid in the right direction at last. And so everyone is healthy and fit and enjoying life. And I think, but that's the ecosystem and it's the natural systems. I would also like those people that are still around, and I'm sure they will actually have recognized that they are part of nature rather than apart from it. And I think they might, the archaeologists might look back at our generations for a few hundred years and think, how the hell did those people get so disconnected from their source? And we have, as a society, we've become very, very disconnected from source. And I think that future generations will work that out, and they'll get back there. We won't be living like Indigenous people, but we will have a lot of that culture, and we will be stewards of the land, not owners of it.
That's wonderful, Terry. Our time's up, unfortunately. The number of people that have tuned in tonight are testimony to the respect and the reverence that we have for you. Those of us that our lives have been touched by you are the better for it. And it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation, and a privilege. And thank you so much for everything that the last 55 years have taught you to teach us. I can't wait for the next 55, and I hope you're around for lots of it. So thanks so much for tonight, Terry, and thanks for being our guest.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thank you to those of you who've given up an hour of your life tonight to listen to that ramble.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much. Night all. We'll see you again.
Good night.